Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. We are back today working on our Christmas in July project. And if you recall, this is the Bringing Home the Christmas Tree project from the Vintage Christmas book by Lori Holt of Bee in My Bonnet Company. And we're going to be working on the tree block today. So join us right after this and we'll get started on that block. Well, thanks for joining me today. We're working on the tree block of the Bringing Home the Christmas Tree quilt. And of the two blocks, this is going to be what I think is the easier one because it is one technique over and over again. And that technique is flying geese. And if you've watched any of my videos, you know I'm not a fan of flying geese. But in this particular application, they come together pretty quickly. It's a lot of the same thing. So you can kind of go through it pretty quickly and it's fairly forgiving. You're not looking so much for that perfection of your points and your corners because of one little trick, and I'll show you that as we go along. So this is the block we're working on today. It's called the Christmas tree block. And it has 3 trees of varying sizes. And the basics of this block is it's pretty much the same thing over and over again with a couple of fillers and then a couple of subunits that are the tree trunks. And we are just going to quickly go through the basics of this block so that you understand how to put it together. Now, I mentioned this in our previous video, but I'm going to mention it again. This quilt, this block, has a lot of pieces that have to be cut. Now, fortunately with this one, there are 2 different kinds of flying geese. So as long as you keep those separate, you should be okay. And that's in the width of the fabric. And when you're cutting the fabric, what I recommend is that you cut first in any of these blocks, and not so much with this one because most of these are the same size, more or less. But you start with the biggest piece and then you work down. And if you've got 3 or 4 pieces that you have to cut that have the same size, either on the length or the width, cut a strip that size and then cut all the sub pieces that you can out of it and then move on to the next size. And I think that that will help you to be able to use your fabric efficiently and be able then to stretch it as far as you can. For example, in this block, and let me open to the other page because I had clipped the other one. For this particular block, for example, it says that in the background fabric, we'll talk about that, it has some 2.5 by 3 inch rectangles, and then it has some 2.5 inch squares. So what I would do is I would cut the 2.5 and then first start cutting the 3 inch rectangles. And then once I had all those done, then I would cut the 2.5 inch squares. Now if you have a piece of fabric, because I don't know how wide your fabric is, and it needs 4 of each, and you can only cut 2 of the rectangles, then at that point start cutting your squares. So you're using up as much as you can. And then that little piece that you have left over, put it in your scrap pile, because you may find with the other block that you have a use for that. So you don't want to throw it away. I think if it gets under 1 inch by 1 inch, you can toss it. But we do use some 1 inch by 1 inch pieces in the other block in different fabrics. I don't know which one yet, but I would just hold on to those just for a little while. If you could cut an inch by 1 inch square, hold on to it. Otherwise, toss it. Okay, with that said, then let's start looking at this block. And let me make sure that you're lined up so that you can see it correctly. Now in this block, you've got two different kinds of flying geese. You've got this piece here where we have actually cut off the top of the flying geese. And then you have another block like this one where you have the actual point and the point shows. So you've got three of those, and then the rest of them are the skinnier block. And that skinnier block, for me, made the difference in making this go faster and be a little more enjoyable than flying geese usually is for me, because I didn't have to worry about that point except for the three at the top. And then you're going to add to those flying geese a couple of spacer pieces and then the tree trunks. Now the tree trunks are very simple. They're just straight seams. The flying geese, let's talk about that. And when I prepared this, I tried to keep the pieces for each block, because if you're going to make the full-size quilt, you're going to need 4 of these. I tried to keep them separated into separate bins so they didn't get mixed up. And part of my reasoning for doing that is that she calls for, in her pattern, making the tree pieces out of scrappy green fabrics. And I did not want to have all 4 of my tree blocks. I didn't want them to look exactly the same. And I wanted to make sure that all of the fabrics I used were more or less equally distributed among the blocks. So in order to have those fabrics distributed, what I did was I set it out and decided which pieces would go in each block and then put them in their own little container. That helped a lot because I did not have to wonder where pieces went or have to dig through a bunch of stuff to do it. And I think I'll use that same technique as we move forward into the card blocks, because we're going to be dealing with the same thing. We're going to deal with a lot of the same, but some different, and that helps. And again, I want to remind you to cut very carefully. Make sure that you get the full size that you need. Make sure you've got the right number that you need. It begins to get a little confusing when you're cutting a lot of the same thing or a lot of the same size, or you've got sizes that are just a little bit different. So just make sure you've got exactly what you need. And also that consistency in how you cut. Don't use every ruler you have. Pick a ruler or 2 that you use and make sure that you're consistent with your cutting so that everything's going to come out together. And we're going to talk about stitching in just a minute. Okay, so we're going to work on this one, and I have one that is partially put together that we're going to move on to now. And we're going to talk about this a little bit. Now, the tree trunks, they're just straight stitches, and we're going to sew those on the machine. One thing I will tell you is that when you're working with a block that has a lot of pieces, the tendency is for every time you have a seam in that block, it gets just a little smaller and just a little smaller and just a little smaller. So the way I combat that is to make sure that I've cut my pieces the correct size, or maybe just the width of that line bigger. And then when I'm stitching on a straight seam that's got a seam allowance, I set my machine so that I get just a little bit skinnier stitch. When I'm using my 1/4 inch foot with the little guide on the side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my machine so that instead of a 1/4 inch, or what it thinks is a 1/4 inch, we're going to move our needle towards the guide just slightly so we get just that skin. So the settings for the 1/4 inch seam on my machine are 8.3 for the needle placement or the width and 1.8 for the length. Well, I don't like to use that 1.8 for regular sewing because it's so small that if you have to take it out, it's a pain. So I adjust that to 2.4, which is about my standard stitch for most things. And then the needle placement is 8.3, and I'm going to change that to 8.7, which is 0.4 over. And that just gives me just the slightest amount to make that seam just a little bit narrower. And it's going to help me to make my blocks as big as they need to be. I'm not going to lose that little bit with every seam. And when you've got a lot of seams, it really does make a difference. Now, I do have to set it, and I have to remember to set it. So my method to remember setting that is using a piece of chalkboard tape on my machine, writing the project, the setting, and what I need to change it to. So I know as long as I'm working on this project, there's my information. And I've got about enough room here to put the information for 2 projects. So if I'm flipping back and forth, I can keep up with that. There's a little tip that I learned the hard way. Okay, let's go back to our block. So when we sew these, we're going to use this, but we're going to come back to that in just a minute. For our regular flying geese that are going to be cut off at the top, part of that is driven by the size they're cut. And as you cut those pieces, you'll determine that. But what we're doing is we're putting those 2 corner squares and sewing them in a diagonal and then flipping it. And I have one up here that is going to be a good example of this. The ones I have are the ones that are going to give us the points, so the ones at the top. So here we go. Here we've got our rectangular piece here. We've sewn one side on and we've trimmed it. And then we're going to sew the other side. And I took a pencil and a ruler and drew a diagonal line across the square. And then we're going to stitch right on that line. Now for this, since we're sewing across the fabric, we do not use that 1/4 inch. But I'm still going to keep my stitches at 2.4. Now, when we're sewing here, we're going to catch this little point when we start sewing. I always put a little piece of fabric in here so my thread can get started there. And then I'm going to have my needle down and I'm going to put my fabric right in there. And then as I stitch, I'm just going to kind of pull that extra piece of fabric through. And we're stitching right on the line. All the way to the edge. And then I have a second one, and to save time, I'm going to stitch it next. And that's one of the ways that in this block you can really save yourself a lot of time by prepping these in batches and sewing them in batches. You could sew all of the right sides and walk away and then come back and press all those, trim them, come back, sew all the left sides, and etc. Whatever works for your schedule. Obviously, the less time you have to sit and work on this at a time, the fewer components you're going to be able to, or the fewer processes you're going to be able to do, but you could do it this way for the whole quilt because there's a lot of repetition. So we're sewing our second one here and we're just going right down that line. You don't want to use ink. You don't want to use I wouldn't use a super soft pencil. Just a regular pencil should work. I know a lot of people use mechanical pencils because it gives you that really fine line. I find they're a little difficult because they want to grab a hold of the fabric. So usually I just use a regular pencil. But we just don't want to draw it too thick or too dark We don't press too heavy, because when you press heavy, you distort the fabric. And also your line is going to be a little thicker, a little darker, a little more visible. Okay, so we've got those sewn. And we didn't experience any puckering or any distortion. They're pretty straight. And then we're just going to trim them up. And we can do that a couple of ways. We can either use our rotary cutter. Let me get a shorter one. And place that seam line right on the 1/4 inch. And trim it. Now you want to be really careful when you do that, that your cutter is going right where you want it to go. I think I need a new blade. I definitely need a new blade. Or you can just cut it with your scissors. And I'll tell you what I normally do. Let me see if I have them. I do. I have a pair of sewing room utility scissors. These are ones that are only used in here. I do cut paper with them. I do cut mylar with them. But for situations like this where you're just trimming the fabric away from a seam, they work pretty good. They're still pretty sharp. And I find that if I'm trying to get a lot done, they don't have to be overly precise. You just want it trimmed right there about 1/4 inch. All right, we've done that. We're going to take our 2 pieces that we just cut off and put them in our scrap pile. And then we have these. So I want to talk a little bit about pressing, because you're going to have a lot of seams in this particular block. And you want to be careful about your pressing, because your pressing is going to keep your little subunit at the size it should be. It's also going to make it lie flat. You're going to have fewer problems with the seams kicking up when you sew them together. So let's press. And I also will tell you that I would recommend a full-size iron so you get more pressing surface. Usually they get a little bit hotter too. Now, the book said, I believe, that we're just going to press this open like this. And that's really easy. But I wanted to keep the underside of the quilt, or the part of the seam that would show through to the front, I wanted to keep it as invisible as possible. So what I chose to do is to iron it the other way. Now that is going to mean that some of my seams are going to be thicker, because all of them are going in that same direction. But this way, I don't have anything showing underneath my background fabric. So that's how I'm pressing mine. Now, normally what I do when I'm batch pressing these with the larger iron is I will put them down where I'm holding this piece out. And then I will press and slightly pull at that so it gets nice and tight on the seam, and then press over with my big iron. And that usually is a little bit faster. Just trying to demonstrate that a little bit. I can just kind of roll it right over or get it really close and then slightly lift it and press down. Pressing versus ironing. Sometimes I find you have to do a little bit of both. Okay, so we've got that finished. Now, as we said before, this is a scrappy look. So where did they go? That's a great question. Where did they go? Well, I can see here from my placement that this one can't go here. There would be 3 in a row. So I'm going to put it in the middle, and then I'll put this one here. Now then I noticed that I've got a little bit of a problem because I think that's I've got 2 here, so I'm going to take this one out and substitute it with this. So now I've got we've got 2 here. It gets to be a bit of a puzzle, doesn't it? So you just want to kind of play with these a bit to see what works for you, and you can adjust them around. In fact, that's what I'm going to do right here a minute. So we've got 4, 6, and 5. And then our little tree trunks. And I need to sew those tree trunks really quickly. And it looks like somehow I'm missing one. So let me see if I have another one. And I'm going to sew those while we chat a bit. Now, for my design, what I decided to do was have 2 of my tree blocks exactly the same. The fabric placement is the same. The design is the same. And then for the other 2, they're going to be a little bit different. And they're going to be different from the first 2, but different from each other as well. And that kind of gives it that little bit of a scrappy look. Now I'm adjusting my machine back as I talked about. Okay, and we're ready to go. This is going to be really, really quick. Now, sometimes when you're doing this, it can seem a little overwhelming because there are so many pieces, but I would just encourage you to break it down into sections that you can wrap your head around and work on, and then come back and worry with the rest of it. The other tip that I will give you is that in addition to all these pieces, and let me tell you, when you're working on this and you're cutting all these green pieces, you're going to think it never is going to end because there are a lot. There are 11, 15 of these flying geese in each block, and then you've got 4 of them. And then when you get all that done, what you'll figure out is when we get to the tree block, the car block, you've got another tree, a bigger tree in each one of those blocks. So it's a lot of pieces. And make sure that if you are doing this scrappy like I am and you have a limited amount of scrappy fabric, that you divide that scrappy fabric so that you have a little bit in every block, or it's going to look off. Now, the way that I find that I can manage a project like this is, like I said, trying to work in batches. If I were to sit down and try to tackle this whole thing at one time, it might become a bit overwhelming. I would probably be recounting things multiple times. I would lose things, that's for sure, and probably work on it an hour or 2 and get up frustrated. But if I'm able to say, tonight I'm going to focus on getting the background pieces for my tree blocks cut, I can usually do that. I've got enough room here that I can set everything out and be efficient with how I do it. I can cut those pieces. If I need to get up and leave, I can do that. That, I will tell you, that was the one overall best thing about having a dedicated sewing area, is if you're doing something and something happens and you have to get up from it, that you could just leave it and come back to it later. And I know for a lot of you, that's not possible. That was not possible for me for years. I was sewing on a dining room table or kitchen table. There was a time I sewed on a desk, so sometimes you just have to manage. But if you have the ability to set it aside, that's what I recommend. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're just going to start assembling the blocks. Let's take this finished one away. And here's what we have. And what we're just going to do is we're just going to start from the bottom and work our way up. And we're going to pin. And what I like to do, because like I just told you, I like to sew in batches, is the first thing I'll do is I'll pin all of the bottom flying geese to the tree trunks. And with these, I just start pinning at the edges. And then I'll stretch it a little bit if it's not quite the right size. That one looks exceedingly big for some reason. Check our sizes. It does look a little bit big. Let's check another one. Same as that one. Okay, maybe that one's just a little small. Okay, so in that case, we'll come in just a fraction of an inch from the edge of the trunk base on both sides. And I'm talking like 2 threads. And then we're just going to ease it in, as I call. I love that phrase, ease it in. And I usually pin it so that I catch those seams underneath, because I really prefer that they not come flapping out. So that's pinned. I've caught the seams here. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start stitching. I've got all 3 of those done. And we're just going to stitch. And I think that I will have the tree trunk portion up. And we're just going to sew. And as I'm sewing it, I'll be honest with you, I'm giving it a little bit of a tug because we're working with those bias seams on the top of the tree, the flying geese, and I think it needs just that little bit of help. They want to pull up. And when I say pull up, it's something akin to shrinking a bit. And I think that the next time that I do flying geese, when I draw that line, I am going to draw it just a little less than the absolute center, like a pencil line width, so that I'm sewing to the point of where the fabrics join together a little bit. And that will give my snowball part, it'll be just a little bit smaller in the piece we're going to cut off, but it's going to be just a little bit bigger in the piece that folds over. We can always trim it up if we need to, but it'll give me just a little bit bigger size to work with, and I think that's going to help. These are sewn in order, so we should be able to just trim those, take the pins out, and there we go. Whoops, there's more pins by there. That's going to be our first layer of pieces. Okay, you can see that, how that's going to come together. And then these are going to be adjusted. This is the very bottom of the block. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a few minutes and sew the rest of them on so that I come back, we'll put the spacers on the two tops and sew them all together. So we'll be right back in just a flash. All right, let me tell you, it's been probably about 8 minutes since we left before, and we've got all of the pieces with the flying geese put on here. Nothing is pressed, but they're all together. And we have got 2 pieces left in our box for this block. So we're just going to take a look here at where they go, and this one is going to go here, and this one is going to go here. And we're going to hook those together. That's pretty straightforward. Now, I will tell you that in sewing, when you're following a pattern, you're going to expect that everything is going to fit together exactly, right? And the reality is, it hardly ever does. Usually there's some kind of difference, whether it be one piece is cut a little wonky and it is not quite where it needs to be for your seams to match up. It could be that one is a little wider than the other. And I ran into that a bit with these, in that they're all there are all these flying geese, and that flying geese is cut, or not cut, it is sewn on that bias, and it is, I think, extremely difficult to press because you don't want to stretch it, but you also have to press it flat. And you're kind of trading off between one and the other, and sometimes it works out just really well and sometimes it doesn't. So if you're facing a situation where it's almost there but it's not quite exact, just split the difference and go with it, because most of the time when you're talking about a size difference like we are with these, it's not going to matter. If you're talking about something that's 1/8 of an inch or larger, you're probably going to have to go back and figure out where it went astray because you want enough fabric past your seam line so it doesn't fray out. So that's just my word of advice and what I do in my sewing. So pretty quickly, once you get all those flying geese made, it will go together really quickly. And now before we sew these 3 pieces together, we're going to have to really focus on some great pressing to get all of the seams pressed in the right direction and consistent directions, and make sure that they're open as flat as they're going to be. But this is the basic for this particular block. And what I'm going to do is once I get it pressed, I'm going to put 2 together and sew them. Now, I want all my seams to go in the same direction. So for the flying geese, I'm going to press them up so that the seam allowance is hidden mostly by that darker fabric. And then this one will go up as well because there's so much bulk there. And because of that, you're not going to be able to nest the seams from strip to strip. So you're going to have a lot of bulk in those seams. So here's what I recommend. We're not going to do it on our video, but I recommend that you use a lot of patience to make sure that you've got that seam open really well. Use a lot of pins or clips or whatever your preferred method is to make sure that you line up not only the seam, but you keep that seam allowance going in the direction that you want to. And even with really super careful attention, you're probably going to find that 1 or 2 of them goes astray on you. But that is basically how to put this together. And to wrap this up, I just want to go back and remind you of a couple of things. Be sure to measure correctly when you're cutting and cut carefully. Be sure to recount your quantities and make sure that you've got the right fabric and the right sizes. And I always find if I lay it all out, that works for me. You may even want to label the letter in the book that designates this piece on your stack of pieces, especially when we get into having a lot of pieces. That might be helpful. And you also want to make your process as painless and quick as possible by batch sewing, batch pressing, batch pinning, anything you can do to make it more successful. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of working on or bringing home the Christmas quilt. If you liked it, please give us a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next week with another block right here at the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Bye.